Okay, so we're at another lunch break session. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, welcome. My name is Jay Woodworth. I work as the Christmas tree specialist for Perennia Food and Agriculture. Normally my office would be based out of Bible Hill, but of course due to COVID, I'm still working in the home office. So that's where I'm joining from today. I also have with me Lienna Hoeg, who is the Christmas Tree Council of Nova Scotia's research technician. Lienna, do you just want to unmute and give a wave?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today.
All right, so our background, I have a master's degree in soil science. I do have my pesticide applicator's license, so I've been dabbling in this for a little while, but lucky enough, I have Lienna with us today as well, who is working on her master's in weed science. So hopefully we should be able to answer most of your questions as they pertain to Christmas tree lots, but if not, feel free to always send us an email later and we will find you an answer if we don't know it right off. So today's lunch break session, we are looking at herbicide recommendations, so just specific to herbicides being weeds, and pesticide guide updates for 2021. So I think most of you are probably familiar with the pesticide guide that we publish annually, but if not, we'll get into that shortly anyways. So today, what we're going to be following, I'm going to start off by doing a little bit of theory. So we are going to talk just about some of the basic concepts of ecology. If you've attended some of our PCRP workshops in the past, you might recognize a few of these slides, but I've tried to keep it short in the interest of time. We're also going to review some of the basic concepts of integrated pest management, so looking at controls outside of chemical controls as well. We're going to talk about herbicides as a last resort, so bringing in that chemical control option as your last stage in the control process. We're going to briefly go over how to read pesticide labels again, talk about toxicity ratings, and then I'm going to hand it over to Lienna to do some common weed identification. So she's going to go ahead and introduce the common guide for weeds in Christmas tree lots, which is another publication that we update as we need to. And she's going to walk you through one specific example. I believe we're using juniper today, and kind of introduce some other control options aside from chemicals. Then we're going to get into a case study, and we are going to make the assumption that we've tried all these other cultural practices and need to go with the chemical control option. We're going to look at just a weed population from a lot that we had identified and try to work through the process of what we would do to determine which herbicide to use in this case. And it is going to be vision that we're going to be looking at for that case study. Finally, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what has changed for the pesticide guide updates for 2021. So if you're familiar with using the manual, you will notice there's a few extra products listed in there for this year. So I'm just going to very high level go over what some of those changes are. And then finally, I've got a little resource tab there. That's just going to give you an introduction to where you can get your pesticide applicator's license if you don't already have one or you're not familiar with the process, as we've had a lot of questions on that lately. So that's going to be our outline for today. I do have a lot of slides today. I tried to cover just a little bit of everything. So I'm going to try to chat a little bit faster than normally, but that's in hopes that we'll get through this and then be able to answer a few questions. And if we don't get to a question period, please feel free to reach out to us anytime, especially if you have specific questions on any identification or recommendations. We can do that for you on an individual basis. All right, so starting with the ecology component, this is the scientific definition of ecology. So ecology is the study of interactions, which I think most of us would probably understand on a high level basis. So the true definition, the scientific study of interactions between organisms and their environment. So that's anything and everything. That can be mammals as they interact with their environment. That's your water cycle. That's your soil nitrogen, your soil carbon cycles. All of those systems that are constantly ongoing in an environment make up the environment's overall ecology. And looking at those interactions from a scientific eye is what the study of ecology is known as. So thinking about that in a Christmas tree lot, there's not too many people on with us today. So if anybody's comfortable, if you'd just like to unmute yourself and holler out just a couple of interactions that might be happening in a Christmas tree lot. So I've got the picture on the screen, but maybe let's just try to list off two before we move on.
Jay, looks like I see some goldenrod in the back part of the lot there. And that's something I experience as well, along with young hardwood that I'm trying to control too.
Exactly. Thank you, Mike. Just one more. Let's pick on Sam. Can you give us an example of an interaction that might be happening in Christmas tree lot?
I guess first thing I would think about would be the multi-stages. So what would grow there depending on the succession of the lot. So if you have older trees, or if you're just trying to establish a new lot, what kind of weeds you'd run across.
Super, thank you. Okay, one other, I guess, kind of theory that I want to just review. I hammer this slide at pretty well every presentation I give because I think it's important to always be keeping this in the back of your mind. But the ecological maxims, so these are kind of the laws of ecology, if you will. So there's 8 of them. They're all pretty self-explanatory. I am going to read them out. You can come up with your own examples if you would like. We'll go into more depth with this at the next pesticide course, but for now, you can never do just one thing. So every input that you put into your lot affects more than one thing. So for example, if you put fertilizer on to try to get your trees to grow faster, you're also going to have your weeds growing faster. So it's never just one individual component that you can target. Everything goes somewhere. So any inputs you're putting in, you're never completely losing them. Your plant is not using up everything that goes in there. There's always some aspect of runoff, for example, that could be happening. It's never staying right where you plan. No population can increase in size forever. So we can think of lots of population checks there, coyotes and rabbits, for example. There's no such thing as a free lunch. I think everyone understands that one. Evolution matters, time matters, space matters. So these are all check factors that will control populations. And finally, life would be impossible without species interactions. So just trying to adjust our mindset so that we're thinking about these ecological maxims when we make management decisions is a good step in the right direction. So now going back to our lot, I've introduced here a cycle. So we've talked about some examples that could be happening in the lot. So your succession, your weed populations, how those are changing over time and over space, like the maxim we just suggested. So if we left the system entirely on its own, I mean, obviously it's a managed tree lot here, so it takes a little bit of imagination. But if the system were just left to go and check its own populations and introduce its own species interactions, it would cycle regularly on its own indefinitely. The thing that changes this, and the reason we have to look at managing our lots or managing any kind of culture that you're working with, is because when you introduce a disturbance, that changes the cycle and it's no longer functioning on its own. So we said earlier, we introduce one little tiny change, it affects everything in that system. So we introduce a disturbance into the cycle. I've got a person here, it doesn't have to be a person. If you have a huge increase in a population, it'll do the same thing. But introducing disturbance is what takes these cycles off. So a few examples of the disturbances that are introduced in this particular system could be production, the use of resources, cohabitation, and species populations adjusted through resources. So if you run out of space, for example. So here's just a few examples of disturbances. These are the ones that I think are most easily recognized, so I like to talk about them. On your far right-hand side, that's a bat, and you'll notice it's got a bunch of white stuff on its face. So this white nose syndrome was a disease that came in and basically checked our bat population ages ago. It came in with European cavers, so people do caving for a hobby. So they'll go and climb a cave in Europe, for example, as a leisurely activity. But when they come back and climbed cages in the Maritimes, they brought back this white nose syndrome, which our bats weren't prepared to deal with. So it really took a big hit in our population. So that's an example of a specific disturbance that changed the ecological cycle. There's also an example there of Dutch elm disease, emerald ash borer. I think you'll recognize quite a few of those, but the same idea. So that kind of warms us up for integrated pest management. So the reason that we have to do any kind of management at all is because we are trying to manage a culture. So naturally, we're introducing a disturbance. We're cutting a tree, we're using something off the land. So we have a disturbance that's invested there, and we have to manage it through controls. So the best way we can do this is through IPM, integrated pest management, trying to use all of the tools available to us to get control of a particular pest. So the definition of a pest, and I like these ones in particular. So a pest can be anything, really. It can be any animal or plant that is either harmful to humans or concerns humans. So that can be a creature that damages crops, livestock or forestry, those are the most popular, or anything that causes a nuisance to people, especially in their homes by that definition. So if you have a bear in your backyard who's going through your garbage, that's considered a pest. So we're at the point where humans have modified the environment so much for our own purposes, and we're somewhat intolerant of other creatures occupying our space, that the pest definition is just defined by the objective of a human. So anything that we consider a pest that inconveniences us, and thus an elephant is unobjectable in its natural habitat, but when it tramples a crop, it's a pest. And I have this example from one of our smart tree Christmas tree sites in the southeastern region. So this was a pest for Lienna there during that day at her site visit. All right, so trying to control pests, of course, we eventually introduced pesticides. We introduced chemicals to do that. After the World War, we learned an awful lot about chemical welfare, so the pesticides really started to ramp up. We were just producing a lot of chemicals. So much so that the annual US production of pesticide products in 1975 had increased from 150 million pounds to 660 million pounds, which is pretty drastic, and that's new products included in there as well. So back in the early 70s there, we were developing control programs for pretty well all kinds of pests. We had houseflies, lice, malaria. Gypsy moth was one of the pests that they were working on controlling as well, which is interesting to us now. And these are just some of the kind of old school ads that you would see around. So using pesticides in a household environment was very, very common back in this time. The problem with that is that eventually we had a collapse of control. So for a while, things were working really well. We had lots of control of headlights. We didn't have any house flies because we were just covering them in DDT. Things were going good until we started to see what the impacts of those disturbances were on ecological systems. So this is a drastic example. I'm well aware of that, but I think it's just good to review this whenever we get an opportunity before we get into the pesticide chat. So some of the collapses that had come from all of these new chemicals that were put out were massive fish declines, thinning shells of large birds. So eagles, I think most people are familiar with that concept, and you've got that up in your right-hand corner. That's an example of an eagle shell. Pesticide resistance, which we'll talk about in a minute, environmental pollution, and of course, side effects to humans, even breast cancer was listed there. So I'm just going to review this concept of pesticide resistance, and we had done a pretty good job developing that in mosquitoes in particular in Asia. So what happens for pesticide resistance, there's a really good diagram here. You've got pests on a plant, you're spraying the plant. Some of them will die, but not all of them will die. So effectively what you've done is singled out the populations that have some resistance. And of course, what are they going to do if they survive? Breed again, and then you get more populations that have that resistance within them. So that's how we get pesticide resistance, which is why you get so many recommendations to switch up your products and try to look at alternate control options. So integrated pest management, by definition, this one's from 2003, is a decision-based process involving coordinated use of multiple tactics for optimizing control of all classes of pests. So that includes weeds, insects, fungus, pathogens, vertebrates, whatever you're considering to be your pest. And this last part here was kind of added in the early 2000s in an ecologically and economically sound manner. So after we had all those problems, we started adding in social acceptance and ecological responsibility to this picture. So what does that mean? So IPM, simultaneous management of multiple pests, it includes regular monitoring. So we've got other lunch break sessions where we've talked about doing lot scouting and why it's important to get an inventory of what's actually present in your lot so that you know what the natural enemies and other controls might be present for your area. This also includes use of economic or treatment thresholds when you're applying pesticides. So I think the economics portion is in the back of everybody's mind anyway when you're making decisions. And of course, the integrated use of multiple suppressive tactics, including physical, biological, cultural, and then chemical. So here's a handy little infographic. The key strategies for IPM, first one is prevention. So that's doing your lot scouting, making sure you're keeping track of what's you're monitoring your insect populations, for example, you're monitoring your weed dynamics within a lot and you have an idea of what's coming. your intervene is just going to happen when it gets out of control. So everybody has a little bit of goldenrod in their lot. So it's not a problem until you're trying to walk to a tree and you're falling down over goldenrod, essentially. So you need to figure out what your risk threshold is. And when you have an idea that you're approaching that threshold, you need to start looking at implementing your control measures. And usually we recommend that you implement your cultural, biological, and physical control measures before you move on to your chemical control measures. But if we're making the assumption that we've already exhausted those options or they just aren't practical, and we're looking at chemicals as an alternative, then herbicides are an option as your last resort. So this kind of IPM infographic here, we've got steps 1 through 7, first one being inspection, prevention, identification, so that all falls under your scouting, analysis. 5 is treatment. So this is something I like to talk about with the cycle here. Once you've actually applied your control, that doesn't mean that you stop scouting. So you're going to go back out and do your monitoring and make sure that that's working. And it goes around like that in a cycle. We've introduced the concept of crop scouting in the past. I'm just going to share this slide again. The purpose is to identify potential pests and disease, diagnose visible indicators, and gauge the health of a lot from a representative sample. So you're never going to be able to know every population that's present in your lot, whether it be for insects or weeds or other pests, what have you. But if you're doing a good job taking a representative sample and taking it over multiple periods of time throughout the season, so for example, spring through summer, then you're going to have a pretty good idea of what's going on, and that'll support your decisions. So one of the questions we get a lot through the research team is diagnosis or identification of what a problem is. And usually we get sent a sample. Sometimes we get like a needle sample of balsam fir, for example, and it's just brown. So you know that there's something wrong, the needles are dead. But there's so many different things that could be happening. And if you don't have that lot scouting history to kind of back up what's been happening over time, then we might not always be able to identify what's in that sample. So the diagnosis that we look to could be mechanical damage, damage from vertebrates, damage from chemicals, damage from weather, some kind of disorder. It could be a disease, or it could be from insect or weed pressures, which is where your scouting and monitoring for your control is going to come into play. So we're going to go through the pesticide labels and toxicity right now. This is perhaps the least exciting part, but following we're going to look at weed ID, so things will get better. Any pesticide sold and used in Canada must be registered by the PMRA, which is the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. It must have an approved product label that contains key information on the pesticide. Information based on the PMRA approved studies is carried out by the manufacturer, but these studies involve human health, environmental concepts, and effectiveness against specific pests. So the information on what product you're using is always going to be in the label. And I don't just mean the sticker that's on the bottle, I mean the full document that should be coming with the product when you purchase it. It is illegal to use a product differently than for the purpose or in the manner that is stated on the label, and that's under the Pest Control Products Act. So your pesticide label has 2 primary parts. You've got the primary display panel and the secondary display panel, and we go through more of that when we talk about our pesticide workshops. But when you receive a product, when you purchase a product, you're probably going to get a 15 to 20 page document with it. And in that document will be all the standard information. So I highlight this kind of first sentence here. It's illegal to use a product differently than for the purpose or the intent, the manner that's stated on the label. And I say that because when we get into chatting about our pesticide guide, that is all products that are specifically designed to be used in Christmas trees or balsam fir plantations, that type of thing. So when you're thinking about using a product, there's lots of products out there that aren't necessarily registered for Christmas trees or for Christmas tree plantations or for forestry that would be effective in a Christmas tree lot, but it's your responsibility to use it as it was intended. I'm just going to display this here in case anybody wants to find it later, but contact information for PMRA through Health Canada is posted there. The second thing I like to mention is that there is an online label search. So if for some reason you purchase a product and you either lose the label or it didn't come with it perhaps, then you are able to go find the pesticide label for any product that's registered in Canada. Common weed identification. I will mute myself, Lienna, you can take over.
All right, I'll still get you to flip through the slides for me, I guess. But yeah, so Jay had touched on our guide to common weeds found within Nova Scotia Christmas tree lots. This was produced last year, but it's updated on a continual basis. And there should actually be an updated version coming out this week before our field day in Lunenburg. So that's exciting, but currently it covers 16 weeds that are commonly found within Christmas tree lots, as well as some tools to help identify as well as control them. So I guess Jay already touched on what integrated pest management is, and it can be different between insects and pests, but here we're going to talk about integrated vegetation management. And there's 4 different pillars or methods that you can use to help control weeds found within your lots. The first would be physical and mechanical control, which includes tillage, repeated cutting and mowing, as well as flame weeding. I know within Christmas trees, it's a perennial crop, so tillage isn't used all that often unless you're putting in a plantation or something along those lines, but typically it's more so focused on repeated cutting and mowing and some other forms of physical control. You have cultural control, which also includes crop rotation, fertility management, and cultivar selection. Again, with Christmas trees, crop rotation isn't all that isn't used all that often, so we're more focused on the fertility management as well as the cultivar selection there. For biological control, it's just using beneficial organisms to control others. So there's some insects that will target specific weeds. Sometimes it can be helpful, and other times using those beneficial organisms can have an impact on other agriculture systems. So you do have to be mindful there. And of course, there's chemical control, which is the use of herbicides pre and post emergence. And today I'm going to be talking about juniper. So this is a low growing woody perennial that's commonly found in Christmas tree lots across the province. It's native to North America. I believe there's about 150 different varieties, but there's 2 varieties that are found within Nova Scotia. We have common juniper as well as creeping juniper. And we know that this weed has, it's only a weed in Christmas tree lots, but for this plant, it's known for medicinal and cultural and culinary purposes, but in Christmas tree lots, it's a weed. It's in the way. So in terms of identification of these plants, they both have the same growth habits. So common and creeping juniper will reach a height of about 1 meter. The difference between them is actually the needles. So on common juniper, it has needles that are about 5 to 20 millimeters in length. They're curved and they're very prickly if you've ever touched them. They can sometimes have a silver appearance to them. And with creeping juniper, it's a little bit different where the needles are really short. They're about 2 to 3 millimeters in length, and they're arranged oppositely along the stem. So it actually looks like they're overlapping and looks like scales. So that's the main difference between those two. Otherwise, they grow quite similar, and the control measures are the same. So in terms of why is this becoming a problem, this plant can establish and thrive in a plethora of conditions. It's extremely tolerant to harsh conditions, and this includes extreme heat and drought, as well as it's quite shade tolerant as well. So again, it can get into some places and be really hard to eradicate. When you're using management strategies to encourage the growth of Christmas trees, and such as fertilizer, this can encourage the growth of the juniper as well. If you get a single plant within your lot and it gets going for a few years, it can actually produce dense, thick mats. We were in a Christmas tree lot actually last week where it kind of feels like you're standing on a trampoline because there's just so much juniper built up there. And also it's hard to limit the spread of this plant because the seeds are spread by animals and birds. And I guess in terms of control, we're going to start out with the mechanical and physical side of things. So of course, you can hand pull if you have ones that are just starting out and they're small. I recommend hand pulling them. But if you have mature plants, you are going to want to cut back the stems and remove the whole rootstock by a mechanical tool or digging tool, whichever works better. You can do this any time of the year, but it's recommended that either you do it when the soil conditions are moist or before the seeds have matured on the plant. You can also do repeated cutting on this. When you first start doing this, it's going to signal the plant to sprout. So it's recommended that you do multiple cuttings over multiple seasons to deplete root resources. You can also tarp the areas that you have cut off you can do this. It might be easier if you mulch the area first, so the tarps will lay flat, and it's recommended to leave those on for maybe about a year to really kill those root systems off with the heat from the sun and the tarps. Moving into biological and cultural control. So there's one potential biological control, and it's grazing by goats or sheep. So this one, I wouldn't recommend solely relying on this method for control of juniper, because it's most likely a last plant resort for most grazing animals. They'll mostly go after grasses and broadleaf plants much quicker than they would go after juniper, but I'm not saying it's unlikely, but it might not get the level of control that you would want. And for cultural, it's not typically considered for juniper, since fertilizing your lots you'll typically be fertilizing your weeds as well. And for chemical control, there is a few options. You can do a foliar application of glyphosate, and always when you're applying any type of pesticide, always go by label recommendations. You're going to want to apply this in the late spring into summer, again, before the cones or the seeds are mature on the plant, and you're often going to have to reapply it as well. So a couple treatments in a season over a couple seasons to really kill established communities of this plant. You can also do a cut stump application also with glyphosate. Again, you might have to repeat it multiple times. So as soon as you cut the stem, you apply the glyphosate application directly to the stump, and hopefully that will help gain control. And the last method of chemical control includes either a soil or a bark application. I think it's hexazoline that works or is recommended for this method. You want to apply this typically in the spring prior to bud break. You can apply it to the soil around the plant or as a basal stem application. And I guess the next slide, please. Okay, so some closing points on management of weeds. So I know in Christmas tree lots, it's really hard to gain control of any weed really within your lot, but it's important to try and work in accordance with your neighbors, because often when you're getting rid of weeds within your lot, those seeds came from somewhere, and most of the time it's from a nearby source. Typically lands there by birds, or even people can take seeds in and out. So also clean your clothing and equipment before traveling between sites. And when you're discarding plant material, just be really careful there. I don't recommend getting rid of it in your own backyard compost system, because typically they don't get hot enough to kill off rootstock or seeds. And also, if you are planning on burning, you want to dry out all your plant material before you do that, because sometimes there can be hazardous vapors that come off of these plants if you're burning them straight after cutting them. Also, you can contact your local landfill and see if they have any programs in place for getting rid of invasive materials. And the last thing I want to mention is if anyone has any weeds or plants that they need help identifying, feel free to send them our way. Just ask that you send photos of close-ups of the plant, so like flowers or the buds or the leaves, and just like maybe where it is within your lot as well. That can help identify. But you can always send those my way, and I would be happy to try and help.
Okay, thank you, Lienna. All right, now we're going to get into our case study. So the point of going through and doing this case study is to get us familiar with how we should be using the guide for insect disease and weed management in Christmas trees, which was recently updated. So I'll show you where to find that shortly as well. So this is what the guide itself looks like. It is available through Perennia, or it's available through the Christmas Tree Council, or I'm pretty sure you can just type in the title of the document and it will come up for you in Google. It's posted in lots of places. So we do update this every year. We just finished the last rounds of updates on it, so it's ready to go again now for 2021. And this document is fairly condensed. It's meant to help you quickly identify what products you can be using in your Christmas tree lots for what particular pest, and that's really the extent of it. If you do want more specific recommendations, we keep a spreadsheet that we run in the back end to create this document. So if you have specific questions, you can call us anytime, and it's not a big deal for us to pop up our spreadsheet and give you more detailed answers. But for now, you can find it, like I said, on the Perennia website. So that's just perennia.ca/resources. there's a search bar in there. You can just search Christmas trees and all of our Christmas tree guides will come up, but this one is Guide to Weed, Insect, and Disease Management in Christmas Trees. It's also on the Christmas Tree Council of Nova Scotia's resource page, as are a whole bunch of other resources. If you haven't checked this out already, the council just updated their full website and there's all kinds of resources on there for you now. So for our case study, I've got a photo here of a Christmas tree lot. I would like to be back out in the field doing workshops, but we're still a virtual platform right now. So we're just going to use our imaginations and say that these are the weeds we identified in our population. So let's say we went out scouting for weeds. We traveled a lot in a zigzag pattern to get a representative sample of what populations were actually there. We recorded any of the weeds that we could identify, and we took photos of the weeds that we couldn't identify and probably sent them to Lienna to get some information. So now we're at the point where we want to categorize our notes based on what type of weed we have out there and what the severity of the risk it poses. And when I say the severity of the risk, I mean to you. So if you're really nervous of poison ivy and that's the main weed you want to try to control, that's fine. That's your target pest. So I've got 5 weeds here that I'm saying we identified in this population. Does anybody want to try to give a guess at which ones they are? See how good we are at ID? Okay, fair enough. Lienna, how many can you get?
Some of those are, I haven't seen many of those, but one might be glossy buckthorn, other looks like fireweed. And then the one with the birch is some type of grass, perhaps.
Oh, birch is the pest.
Oh, birch. Okay. Yeah, that one can be bad. Great.
All right. Okay, so here's our identification. We've got poison ivy, Canada thistle, foxtail barley, purple loosestrife, and birch. So chances are you probably wouldn't find these all in the same lot, but we're going with worst case scenario right now. So let's say we did find all of these weeds in one particular lot, then the next step would be to categorize them. So how our guide works, we have them categorized based on perennial or annual crops, post-emergence, pre-emergence products, that type of thing. So we would go through and categorize them. So birch is easy, that's a tree. So we've got that one out. PB here is what I've got for perennial broadleaf. So that's where your poison ivy, your Canada thistle, and your purple loosestrife are going to fall. And then PG, perennial grasses. So your foxtail barley, your sedges are going to fall into that. So what we need to find is a product that can target either all of these things, or we need to identify what we're most concerned about. So our target, let's say for the purposes of this case study, probably we're going to be targeting perennial broadleaf weeds, because poison ivy, Canada thistle, purple loosestrife are going to be our biggest deal breakers in that particular weed population. So then you figure out what your bonus is. So if you can find a product that will get your main target, your perennial broadleafs, and also get that foxtail barley, your perennial grasses, and maybe even a few trees, your birch, that would be great. So that's the goals that we're looking for. So our control options that we have to manage these weeds, Lienna's already given you a highlight example there with juniper, so physical, biological, and cultural. So we're assuming now we've gone in and tried to remove everything we can mechanically. We've investigated whether there are any biological control options, and we've exhausted all of our measures. So now we're looking at chemical options. So I've got it highlighted there. When you're at the point of making a decision to use a chemical control option, you've already made the assumption that you've either implemented all the other available strategies, or there aren't any applicable or practical available strategies to you. So now we're going to get into using the actual guide. So the first step is to look through your guide and determine what your options are. So we already know that our pests is weed and ground competition. So we're looking at the weed sections, not the insects or the fungus section. Emergence, we're at post-emergence, we're into July now. And target is going to be perennial broadleaf weeds. Bonus if we get grasses, bonus if we get trees. So if you filter out your guide by that, it's just on one page, you're going to be able to find there's 3 main active ingredients that will help you accomplish that. Glyphosate, hexazinone are the most common ones there. So then what we're going to do is go ahead and make a pros and cons list. So this isn't in the guide. This is what you can do on your own based on the information that is in the guide. So I've done it here. Your first one, glyphosate. The pros is that it'll also target grasses. It'll get the birch tree. It's intended for suppression. It has a short re-entry interval. The cons, you're going to have to avoid the branches and the young trees or it will hurt them as well. The toxicity for all three of these is low. Then when you get into the next one, there's a bigger con there, so different rates based on the weed type. So that's a bit of a turnoff right there. If we have to adjust our rate every time we look at a different weed, that's not going to be practical for us. And then finally, hexazinone, that's got a 48-hour re-entry time, and it's recommended that you're applying around bud break in the spring. So that one wouldn't work for us either. So effectively, we've been able to narrow it down to one active ingredient. Mind you, it's glyphosate, so we're still going to have hundreds of different products for it. So now you get to the point where you look at what products are available. So I've listed out just a few here of the more common ones. And this is where you're going to start talking to your suppliers and figure out what product might be right for you. Or reach out to Lienna and say, is there more information in the spreadsheet that will help me make my decision based on my individual lot? So step 2, we're checking those pesticide labels out to try to narrow down our options. So you're either doing that yourself or reaching out to one of us for help. You're asking professionals for recommendations and talking to your suppliers about their products. And then step 3, this is your last one. It's time to make an informed decision about what product you're going to use and assume the responsibility that comes with the use of that product based on what's in that label. Here is the guide. I'll just make it smaller so we can see it. So we just worked through this case study. What we were trying to do was target perennial broadleafs. So this is what the document looks like. Here's our weeds and ground competition. We're post-emergence. There's glyphosate. That was the first one that we narrowed down. All right there. And you can see there's quite a bit more information. This is only the information that's intended for Christmas tree growers. So this is us going through reading every individual word in the label and picking out the application rates for Christmas trees and figuring out what's actually going to be applicable to you so that you don't have to go in and read the label for 20 different glyphosate products. Once you make your decision, you can read that label on your own, but you don't need to read everybody's. So that's where you are there. The last part of that we had mentioned was at the end of our table, I had a toxicity rating. So that is provided in this document as well. If you go to the bottom, there's a product toxicity table, and it will tell you how toxic that product is to both humans and to bees. So if that's something that you're looking to be conscious of, then you can figure out based on the active ingredient, how much risk you're actually posing to bees and yourself when you use that product. So now the updates to the guide for 2021. This is what's changed since last year if you're already familiar with using it. Right now, there's no registered products for needle rust in Christmas tree plantations. There's potentially products that might work, but they're not registered in Canada for the use in Christmas tree lots. Movento is currently the only registered product for gallmage, so that one is included in there. New this year, Atlas has been approved for aphid and balsam woolly adelgid control in Christmas trees. So previously that product existed, but it wasn't, Christmas trees was not included in the label to say that we could use that as a potential industry. So now it is. Same goes for Authority. So Authority Supreme is now approved to use on horsetail application for Christmas trees. So those are your kind of big ticket updates for 2021. Now, going into resources here. This is info on your pesticide applicator's license. This is probably not new for most of you, but in order to purchase and use pesticides in Nova Scotia, you do need to hold a pesticide applicator's license, or you need to be supervised by someone who has a current license. The pesticide applicator's license is based on the National Standard for Pesticide Education Training and Certification in Canada. To get your license, you need to write an exam through Nova Scotia Environment and get at least 75% as a passing grade. And there are courses available to help you ace that exam. And your license will be valid for 5 years. So once the 5 years is up, you either need to rewrite your exam or you have to keep up so many points during that 5-year period to prevent you from having to rewrite your exam. And those points are called recertification points. You need 15 over your 5-year period to a max of 10 in any one particular year. So this coming weekend, we have a pesticide course coming up in New Ross. It was supposed to be in April, but it was rescheduled because of COVID, and I believe it has 5.5 points. So there's quite a few of them right there if you're looking for points, which were pretty hard to find this year, actually. The other thing I just wanted to mention, these are the dates for the online exams for 2021. There were more previous, but those dates have passed, so I've cut them out. If you are writing for the first time, you'll have to submit an application, and that application will have to be received a few business days before the exam. So for example, if you were planning to write the exam tomorrow, July 7th, you would have had to get your application in and received, get the checkoff email by June 29th. So your next possible date, if you're looking to get it, would be to get your application to write the exam in to them by tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. So those are your upcoming dates. Yeah, the only other thing, this is our contact information. If you have more specific questions and want to get a hold of us,